This man was under intense pressure. He stared anxiously at the constantly ticking meter inside the taxi, then glanced at the only dollar bill left in his wallet. When the taxi stopped at an intersection, he flung the door open and bolted out. But after running a short distance, he suddenly remembered. His bone density scanner was still on the passenger seat. Panicking, he turned around, grabbed it, and dashed out of the car, ignoring the furious driver as he sprinted toward the subway station. The taxi driver shouted after him, "Hey, stop you bastard, stop." But Chris just kept running, faster and faster, desperately trying to catch the last train of the day without a ticket. Unfortunately, the scanner got jammed in the train door. The train began to move, and he had no choice but to let go. Chris collapsed emotionally, completely defeated. That scanner was worth an entire month's living expenses for his family. He called home to tell his wife he'd be late, but what he heard next hit him like lightning. "I'm leaving, Chris. I'm walking out of this house." "What? What did you just say?" "I've packed everything. I'm taking Christopher and going now." Her sudden announcement left Chris stunned. A light rain began to fall, as if nature itself was quietly mourning his misery. Chris rushed home. The home that once overflowed with happiness now stood empty, cold, and silent. Under the dim light, he felt utterly alone. Reality had drained him of every last drop of passion and persistence, but life hadn't always been this way. Just a few years earlier, Chris had poured all his savings into buying a batch of high-end bone density scanners, becoming the exclusive distributor in the San Francisco area. He once believed this was the turning point in his life, the beginning of a climb to success. But just as the ship of happiness set sail, a storm hit. In 1981, America was struck by a severe economic crisis. Homelessness spread across the country like a virus. Although his scanners produced slightly better imaging than the competition, they cost twice as much. For 3 straight months, he hadn't sold a single unit. He was 2 months behind on rent, late twice on his taxes. His car had been repossessed, and unpaid parking tickets piled up. Even his son was enrolled in a kindergarten where they misspelled the word happiness. To keep the household running, his wife took on 2 jobs at once. Her temper grew shorter by the day. As for Chris, he hadn't truly smiled in a long, long time. Until one day, he stumbled into a place that felt magical. Everyone there was smiling, genuinely, effortlessly. He stopped a man driving a luxury car and asked him 2 simple questions. "How did you get here?" "I'm a stockbroker." "So, you must have gone to college to become a stockbroker, right?" "Nope, just need to be good at math and good with people." Just like that, "All right, see you around." Chris had always had a natural gift for math. Plus, after years of working in sales, he had developed strong communication skills. So, the idea of trying his hand at stockbroking began to take shape. Back home, when he told his wife he was planning to apply for a job at a brokerage firm, she scoffed. "A stockbroker? Are you dreaming?" But Chris didn't want to miss even the slimmest chance to change his fate. To appear more presentable, he gave his bone density scanner to a street performer at the market, tipped her $1, and kept repeating that it was worthless anyway. However, as soon as he received the job application form, he was stunned to see the street performer running off with his scanner. Chris chased her all the way to the subway station, but could only watch helplessly as she disappeared onto the train. Another month's worth of living expenses, gone. Frustrated, he pounded his fists against the departing train in despair. Trying to calm down, he studied the application form carefully. The brokerage firm accepted 20 interns every 6 months, but only one would be hired in the end. Under the education requirements, it listed a high school diploma along with 3 other qualifications, but those meant little to Chris. That night, he couldn't sleep. Tossing and turning, doubts filled his mind. Should he even chase such a far-fetched dream? The next morning, on the way to drop off his son at school, his wife kept nagging him. "Don't come home unless you've sold that scanner." But after leaving his son, Chris didn't go out looking for customers. Instead, he took the application form and went straight to the brokerage firm's headquarters. Unlike the other job seekers who submitted their forms at the reception desk, Chris bypassed protocol and handed his directly to the HR director, hoping to make a strong impression. But the director, clearly overwhelmed, brushed him off without a glance. As Chris walked down the stairs, he caught a glimpse of the street performer who had stolen his scanner. He chased her relentlessly and finally caught up to her on a city bus, retrieving the stolen machine. After school, Christopher looked at the 2 scanners in surprise. "Dad, you promised you'd desell it, but now 1 + 1 = 2. Chris's wife saw it too. Her face said it all, exhausted, defeated, and done listening. "Whatever, do what you want." Chris pleaded with her, "We'll get through this. Things will turn around okay. You said that before. When I was pregnant with Christopher, you said everything would be okay. So now you don't believe in me anymore. I don't care anymore." The wheel of fate began to turn at that very moment. The appearance of the Rubik's Cube had made it a popular gift item. Back then, a mathematics professor who could solve it in under 30 minutes was considered impressive. Perhaps because Chris had shown a natural talent for numbers since childhood, he nearly managed to solve the cube himself. And that little cube would soon become the key to changing his life. Despite submitting his job application, Chris hadn't received any response yet. Due to the fierce competition in the stock brokerage world, he needed another way in. So he began spending his free time waiting in front of the brokerage firm building, patiently day after day for over a month. Then one day, he finally ran into the head of human resources. Chris seized the moment, hoping to make a strong impression with his analytical and communication skills. But the director was in a rush, heading to another appointment. Not wanting to let the opportunity slip away, Chris blurted out that he was heading to the same place. So the two of them hopped into the same cab. Trying to stand out, Chris kept talking about himself. But the director barely listened, his attention fixed on the Rubik's Cube in his hands. He didn't even look at Chris. Seeing the man so absorbed, but unable to solve it, Chris leaned forward and offered, "I can do it." "No, you can't. No one can." "Yes, I can. I'm sure of it." "You can't." "Let me try. Hand it over." Surprisingly, Chris quickly aligned one side of the cube. He focused intensely, working through the complex puzzle. Even the taxi driver couldn't help but glance back, curious. By the time they reached their destination, Chris had solved the entire Rubik's Cube. The HR director was stunned. He stepped out of the cab without saying a word and disappeared into the building. Chris looked at the meter, $18, then at his nearly empty wallet. He had no choice but to run. He sprinted down to the subway and caught the train just before the doors closed. But in the chaos, he dropped his bone density scanner. Soaking wet in the pouring rain, he called his wife, only to hear the final blow. She had made up her mind to leave. Worried, he rushed home. Just as the storm outside echoed the storm in his heart, his phone rang. It was the HR director. Chris had made it. He was invited to attend an interview in a few days. The director gave him the secretary's phone number for more details. But when Chris looked around, he realized he didn't even have a pen. So he repeated the number over and over, mumbling it like a chant while running to the nearest store in search of paper and a pen. That night, Chris couldn't sleep at all. Early the next morning, he rushed out to find his wife, hoping to bring Christopher back to live with him. But the two ended up having a heated argument right there on the street. His wife was firm, she wasn't backing down. Desperate to spend more time with his son, Chris didn't even wait for school to end. He picked Christopher up early. But as soon as they walked through the front door, their landlord showed up. Rent was already 3 months overdue. The landlord gave them a harsh warning, either pay up or get out. Chris pleaded with him. Finally, the landlord agreed to give him 1 more week, but only if Chris painted the entire apartment. The next day, while painting the walls, Chris wrote a line in frustration. "Chris, you suck." Just then, the doorbell rang. 2 police officers were at the door. They were there to take him to the station. Turns out he had unpaid parking tickets. Chris tried to write a check on the spot, but the banks were closed. The police had to keep him overnight until the bank could verify the funds the next morning. Chris begged them, explaining that his 5-year-old son was home alone and that he had an extremely important job interview the next morning. But the officers wouldn't listen. Defeated, he made a phone call. His wife agreed to bring Christopher back the next day at 6 p.m. that night. Chris spent in a holding cell. It wasn't until the next morning, after the check cleared, that he was released. The moment he got out, he ran at full speed toward the brokerage firm building. He just barely made it in time for the interview. Everyone else in the room was dressed in sleek business suits. Chris walked in wearing paint-stained work clothes. The HR director, who had recommended him, was visibly stunned. Still, Chris walked up and shook hands with everyone in the room. The manager's face clearly showed disapproval. Before anyone could speak, Chris took the floor. "I've been sitting outside for the past half hour, trying to come up with a good excuse to explain why I showed up looking like this. I thought maybe I could make something up, something that would highlight the qualities you're looking for. Honesty, hard work, being a team player, and all that. But the truth is, I couldn't come up with anything." He took a breath. "The truth is, I got arrested for unpaid parking tickets." "What?" "I ran straight here from the police station." "And what were you doing before you were arrested?" "I was painting an apartment." The manager still didn't look impressed. Chris had no college degree, just a high school diploma. But Chris spoke again, this time even more sincerely. "This is who I am. If you ask me something I don't know, I'll tell you honestly. I don't know, but I guarantee you this. I will find the answer, and I will get it done." Chris's sincere words once again sparked interest from the employer. The man leaned forward and asked with a smirk, "If someone shows up to a job interview without a shirt, and I still hire him, what do you think that means?" Chris replied calmly, "Well, then I'd guess his pants must be really special." Everyone in the room burst into laughter. Chris had nailed it. His performance during the entire interview was pitch perfect. But just when he thought he was in the clear, he learned a hard truth. The 6-month internship program came with no pay. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. Out of 20 interns, only one would be hired full-time. That meant he had to sell the remaining bone density scanners and pour his heart and soul into this unpaid job for the next 6 months, all for a 5% chance at success. Carrying the weight of this reality, Chris walked home, heavy-hearted but resolved. He stood in front of the wall and wiped off the sentence he had angrily written before. "Chris, you suck." That afternoon, his wife finally brought Christopher back home. Chris let out a deep sigh of relief, but she had something to say. She was planning to leave for New York to start a new life. Chris agreed, but only on one condition. Christopher would stay with him. His wife didn't argue. She silently walked into the room one last time, gazed at their son, then turned and left without a word. Watching her go, Chris felt utterly powerless. He didn't dare to hold her back, nor did he reach out for a goodbye hug. The uncertain future and the harsh reality of their life made it impossible for him to selfishly ask her to stay. At that moment, a fire ignited in his heart. He made a vow to himself, "I will make it. I have to." That same evening, he picked up the phone and called the brokerage firm. "I'm in," he said. "I'll join the internship." To cut expenses, he and Christopher moved into a cheaper motel. That Saturday, Chris took his son to play basketball. Beaming with joy, Christopher said, "Dad, I want to be a pro basketball player when I grow up." But Chris, overwhelmed by pressure and realism, replied, "Maybe not, son. It's all in the genes. I wasn't any good, so." His words crushed the boy. The excitement in Christopher's eyes vanished instantly. Seeing his son so disappointed, Chris realized his mistake. He knelt down and looked into his son's eyes. "Listen to me, okay? Don't ever let someone tell you that you can't do something. Not even me. If you have a dream, you protect it. People who can't do something themselves will try to tell you that you can't do it either. If you want something, go get it. Period." Those words weren't just for his son. They were for himself. The next morning, Chris took Christopher along as he went door to door, trying to sell the bone density scanners. And finally, a ray of light pierced through the darkness. He sold one. He had money for rent and food again. They had made it through another month. Hope was still alive. Seeing his son staring longingly at some snacks, Chris finally had a few coins to spare and offered to buy him a treat. But Christopher, mature beyond his years, gently shook his head. "I don't want anything anymore." "Come on," Chris coaxed with a smile. "We can get one. Which one do you want? This one, how much is it?" 2 cents. At the same time, Chris's unpaid internship at the brokerage firm officially began. It was relentless. During the day, he attended intense training sessions and studied a thick industry manual. But Chris wasn't just there to blend in, he wanted to stand out. So during breaks, he used every minute to approach executives, trying to make a good impression, asking sharp questions, and picking up on the latest trends in the market. One afternoon, while chatting with a senior broker, Chris's eyes suddenly widened. Across the street, he spotted a familiar figure. It was the mentally unstable homeless man, holding his bone density scanner, the very one he had dropped at the subway weeks ago. Chris quickly excused himself and darted after the man. All his focus was on getting the machine back. He paid no attention to the traffic. A car slammed into him. The collision knocked him to the ground, but he didn't even feel the pain, because the emotional blow of losing that scanner again was far worse. The man was gone, the scanner lost once more. Even his shoe had been thrown off in the accident, and he couldn't find it. Still, Chris limped back to the office. A colleague saw him and chuckled. "Hey man, you're missing a shoe." "Yeah," Chris replied. "Thanks for the heads up." As the only black man in the training program, Chris wasn't just learning finance. He also got stuck running errands, fetching coffee, buying donuts, smiling through it all. After work, he rushed to pick up Christopher. Then they'd take the subway, transfer to the bus, and walk across half the city just to reach their temporary housing. After weeks of training, Chris finally started cold calling clients. His strategy? Efficiency. He wouldn't even hang up the receiver, just hit the next line immediately. Every second mattered. He avoided drinking water to skip bathroom breaks. His goal: finish 8 hours of work in just 5 so he could pick up Christopher on time. One day, fortune seemed to smile. He finally landed an appointment with a high-potential client. The man said he had 5 minutes available in 20 minutes. Chris slammed the phone down and bolted for the meeting. But just as he reached the lobby, his supervisor called out, "Hey Chris, can you do me a favor? Can you park my car real quick?" Before Chris could even answer, the supervisor tossed him the keys and walked off. Helpless, Chris ran to do the task, but the parking space he was aiming for was snatched by another car. He had to drive several blocks away to find a new spot. By the time he sprinted back, the client was gone, another opportunity lost, and the clock kept ticking. To make up for the missed opportunity, Chris decided to take his son to the wealthy client's home over the weekend to personally apologize. Moved by his sincerity, and especially fond of little Christopher, the client invited the two of them to join him and his son for a football game. Near the end of the match, Chris gathered his courage and began to pitch his company's wealth management services. But it was clear the man wasn't going to hand over millions of dollars to a black man he had just met. Even though the deal didn't happen, watching his son laugh and cheer in the stadium made it all worthwhile for Chris. After the game, other VIP guests assumed Chris was a close friend of the wealthy client. They eagerly handed him their business cards. And in the 4th month of his internship, finally, Chris sold off all his remaining bone density scanners. He thought things were finally turning around. But then, reality hit. A letter arrived from the IRS, a $600 tax bill, overdue by 3 months. Without warning, the government emptied what little money he had left in his bank account. He was broke again. The landlord kept pressuring him for rent. Desperate, Chris sought out a friend he'd lent $14 to, hoping to get it back. But the friend coldly refused, saying he'd already paid him back by helping move house. The next day, while playing with Christopher at the park, Chris spotted something. That same homeless man again, still carrying his missing bone scanner. Without hesitation, he ran over and reclaimed it. If he could sell this last one, maybe they'd survive a little longer. He carefully cleaned the machine, polished every surface, and arranged a meeting with a potential buyer. But just as he was about to close the deal, he discovered something horrifying. The scanner was broken. When Chris and Christopher returned to the motel, they found all their belongings tossed out onto the street. The lock had been changed. They were officially homeless. Chris tried to sneak back in through the window, but quickly gave up. He knew there was no point. He turned and took Christopher's hand, walking away in silence. But the little boy couldn't understand. "Why can't we go home?" he asked, tugging at the door, tears streaming down his face. "Listen to me." Chris suddenly snapped. "Stop it, stop crying, please, enough." It was the first time he had ever raised his voice at his son. Nowhere to go, father and son wandered to the subway station. Christopher looked up at him, confused and scared. "Where are we going, Dad?" he asked again and again. But Chris had no answer. At that moment, Christopher suddenly brought up the time machine. He remembered how that crazy homeless man always referred to the bone density scanner that way. Hearing this, Chris had an idea. He knelt down and looked into his son's eyes. "This is a time machine," he said softly. "It can take us back in time." So the two of them began an imaginary time-traveling adventure. Even in the midst of poverty, Chris still wanted to give his son a sky full of stars. He took Christopher into the bathroom of the train station. He spread toilet paper all over the cold floor. Then father and son lay down together. But no matter how many fairy tales he could create with his words, reality always came knocking. When someone began banging on the door from the outside, Chris had no choice. He covered his son's ears gently, stretched his leg across the floor, and braced the door with all his strength. In that moment, the strong Chris finally broke. Not with a scream, not with a collapse, but in silence, in sorrow, in utter despair. Tears streamed down his face. The cold ceramic tiles around him were like the merciless grip of reality, sealing off every escape route for hope. After one of the hardest nights of his life, life still had to go on. From that day on, Chris carried all of his and his son's belongings everywhere, to avoid ever having to sleep on a public restroom floor again. He stood in line with other homeless people outside the church-run shelter, all hoping for just one night of free housing. The Great Recession had led to a massive rise in homelessness. Jobs were scarce. Food was scarcer. Just then, a luxury sports car zoomed by. Inside sat a beautiful woman, unbothered, untouched by the economic disaster gripping everyone else. Back in line, the church worker announced, "There are only 4 spots left." Suddenly, a man cut ahead of Chris and his son. A father's instinct wouldn't let him back down. "This isn't fair," Chris shouted. "I was already in line. I finished work, I picked up my son, and I came straight here. We were on time. That guy cut in front of me." Chaos began to build. The shelter manager, trying to keep the peace, decided to kick them both out. But just before things got out of hand, a middle-aged man stepped forward and vouched for Chris. Thanks to that witness, father and son were allowed to stay. The shelter wasn't luxurious. It wasn't clean, but it had a roof. It had running water, and for the two of them, that was more than enough. After putting his son to sleep, Chris quietly got up and found a spot with a working light to fix the broken bone scanner. As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, he leaned into that faint glow, immersing himself in a sea of financial knowledge. Life kept throwing punches at him, but instead of breaking his spirit, it only fueled his determination. By day, he gave everything he had to serve his clients. By night, he carried his tired body onto crowded buses, holding his son tightly. One day, in a rush, he accidentally left behind Christopher's favorite toy, a small Captain America figure, but there was no time to grieve. Life didn't give him the luxury to cry over spilled toys. Some nights, the two of them were lucky to find a shelter. Other nights, they slept in public restrooms. To keep up with his studies, Chris even used his lunch break to cram. He had no time to rest, no space to fall behind. Eventually, the final exam came. One of the top trainees finished early. Chris handed in his paper shortly after. In the elevator, the confident trainee turned to Chris. "Those chart questions were easy, right?" "Super easy," Chris replied with a forced smile. "What about the essay question on the back page?" "The essay question? Yeah, on the back." Chris froze. There was a question on the back. He walked out of the company gates, trying to stay composed. He was supposed to meet a client, but just then, his boss asked him to borrow some money, just enough for a taxi ride. Chris opened his wallet, only $7, $58 left. He hesitated, then handed over a $5 bill. He had just given away his meals for the next few days. To help his boss, because the exam had taken up so much time, Chris and Christopher missed their spot at the shelter that night. They had nowhere to go. Stomach growling, Chris forced a smile at his son, pretending everything was fine. That night, they slept on the subway once again. Backed into a corner with no more options, Chris made a painful decision. He sold his own blood. At that point, it was the only thing left he could give. There was nothing else. With the $24 he received, the very first thing he bought was an $8 fluorescent light bulb. Even when the world around him was dark, he still chose to bring light. In order to secure a place to sleep each night, they had to squeeze in with dozens of other homeless people. Chris was overwhelmed with guilt, especially toward his little boy. "Dad, is it my fault Mom left?" "What? No, don't ever think that. Your mom left because of her own choices. Not because of you. Do you understand? You're a good boy, a really good boy." After tucking Christopher in, Chris returned to fixing the bone density scanner. He carefully inserted the new bulb and gently flipped the switch. At that very moment, the scanner's light turned on, casting a soft glow through the darkness, like a ray of sunlight piercing a storm. Right on schedule, the doctor who had promised to buy the scanner showed up. A month's worth of living expenses, finally, it had arrived. That night, they didn't line up outside the shelter. Instead, father and son stayed in a small motel room. Maybe it was because they were no longer used to soft mattresses. They both ended up falling asleep on the sofa, but it didn't matter where they slept anymore. What mattered was that they were together. The next day after work, they went to the beach. The noise, the struggle, the weight of survival, all of it felt miles away. And for the first time in forever, they smiled. Today was the last day of Chris's 6-month internship. Thanks to the relationships he'd built on the basketball court, he had managed to bring in 31 deals. But right now, his hands were cold with nerves. Because this internship wasn't like a school test, there was no second chance, no do-over. This was the moment, the one that would change his destiny. But like everything in life, it passed in a flash. In the restroom, Chris ran into the HR director. The man looked him in the eye and said, "Listen, whatever the result may be, you've done incredibly well here, Chris. I mean that. Take care of yourself, okay?" Chris smiled and thanked him, then returned to the office to pack his things. As he was saying goodbye to the people who had supported him, the manager called out to him from across the room. "Hey, Chris, can you come here for a second?" He knew. Everything had finally come full circle. Over the past 6 months, he had poured every ounce of effort into this journey. And now, all that hard work, would it lead him back to the same hard life? Or open the door to a brand new chapter? "I figured I should wear a shirt today, since it's my last day. Thank you very much. But tomorrow, wear it again, okay? Because tomorrow will be your first day on the job." If you still want to be a stockbroker here, Chris. Do you accept? Yes, sir. Great, welcome aboard. Holding that life-changing letter in his hand, his eyes lit up like a rising tide at sea. He tried to hold back the tears, but they welled up anyway, overflowing with everything he had endured. In life, everyone cries at least twice. As he was about to walk out of the room, the manager called him back and returned the $5 he had borrowed earlier. It wasn't just repayment, it was recognition, it was respect. Every bitter night, every cold morning, every lonely step had finally found its destination. If miracles do exist in this world, then their true name is effort. Chris ran out of the company building, tears in his eyes, swept into the sea of strangers on the busy streets. He raised both arms and clapped for himself. In that moment, the seed he had planted in the most barren soil had finally bloomed. In that moment, happiness finally knocked on his door. He rushed to his son's school, scooped Christopher into his arms, and held him like he would never let go. From that day forward, he vowed never to let his child suffer again. This is a true story. By 1987, Chris Gardner had founded his own investment firm, and years later, Chris, now a successful man, caught a brief glimpse of his younger self. Just for a moment, it was like a gentle touch from time itself, a quiet reminder that the pursuit of happiness had finally met reality. At first, I didn't understand the movie, but after watching it again, I saw myself in it. We often ask ourselves, what is happiness? Where can it be found? This is the answer that many people spend their entire lives searching for. But happiness doesn't fall from the sky. When it comes suddenly, it rarely lasts long and is often taken for granted. For those of us with limited means, trying to change our current reality feels like climbing a mountain, not because we're lazy, but because we're held back by countless forces beyond our control. Life always finds a way to test those who strive. We are clearly chasing happiness, but each time we catch a glimpse of hope, reality comes crashing down to extinguish it. Life moves fast, but fortune does knock on our door more than once. The real challenge lies in this. When that knock comes, will we be ready? If we're not paying attention, by the time we realize it, the opportunity may already be gone. The sky provides food for the birds, but it doesn't drop it into their nests. It's the same with life, though it feels like a trial. The harder it gets, the more we must not give in. We must push through on our own. The wise hide their strength and wait for the right time to act. The days spent sharpening ourselves will one day show us the meaning of perseverance, and those who keep moving forward will eventually meet the happiness they've been chasing all along. And that was the journey from despair to triumph, from a man with nothing but a single dollar to a legend who inspires millions around the world. Where are you on your journey? If you're also running, stumbling, falling, remember this: you are not alone. Backhand index pointing right. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment if you saw yourself in this story. And stay tuned for the next episode of How to Be Rich Like, because behind every wealthy person, there's a past no one ever expected.